Ready to administer the visceral blessing, dear viewer? Then grab your bolter and a barrel of popcorn for this action extravaganza. Roll of a Tangent plunges into the world of Warhammer once again. Graham McNeill graces us with a Dark Angel sword story, The Unforgiven. If the archives are to be believed, this was our author's first story for the Black Library. Collected in 2001's book Deathwing, the tale has been republished several times, yet it has always retained its high-octane action. The story follows a Dark Angel brother sergeant named Kaelen, say that 3 times, and his fearless squad of space marines, later joined by the Brother-Chaplain Bareus. Said chaplain informs our heroes that there is a secret, previously shrouded part of their mission. They must capture the cult leader of chaos alive. However, the more our squad members delve into the enemy fortress, the more they learn about the unexplainable connection these heretics have to their chapter and the Unforgiven. There you go. That is the short and long of it regarding this tale. Obviously, the rest of it is going to be full spoilers, and I'm just going to say it right now. Everybody who wants to read this, go read it. It's like 19 pages. It's going to be hard to talk about it without spoiling it, really. Robert, what did you think about this story?
I enjoyed it a bit more than I thought I was going to. I'm not a great. I don't rub my hands with glee when I'm told to read a Warhammer story. And if I must admit, if this were a literature course I was on, and I had this tutor, Nicky Zueff, and I had to write an essay for him every week on a Warhammer story, I'd be really panicking. In fact, I'd be asking my fellow students, could you please explain to me what's going on here, because I've got to write this essay.
I mean, honestly, if that was the case, you could literally just give the same essay the entire year, I think. You just need to change a few words. So the Space Marine chapter this week is Ultramarine, and then the previous week it was Salamanders, and they were fighting Tyranids, and now they're fighting Necrons. You know, it really wouldn't need to do much. It would be a pretty easy task for you. But go on.
Well, I've got a little paragraph I want to quote. Cephasus shook his head slowly. You are deluded, Captain. I think it is time you start looking at yourself and judge the lie you live. You can project it back at me, but I'm only what lives inside each and every one of you. I am a reflection of you all. Yes, well, I can see how that sort of stuff might be the key to a particular story, but the trouble is I don't understand exactly how the key fits. In fact, I don't understand it at all. It's not just not understanding exactly. However, I do appreciate the skill of the depiction of action, and I suppose there is a place in world literature for, well, there certainly is a place for concentrated gloom, because I like Clark Ashton Smith's Empire of the Necromancers.
I really like that turn of phrase.
Yeah,
Concentrated gloom.
Concentrated, picturesque, macabre gloom. And in a way, this is a more frenetic, a sort of more frenetic rendering of the same idea. But the action rather exhausts me, because you can't just sit back and absorb the atmosphere. You've got to concentrate on all the verbs and the who's eviscerating whom and all that sort of stuff, and it can get a bit tiresome. So, and not only that, but it prevents me from, because I've got to use up so much energy in following the action. I've got less mental energy left working out the meaning of the plot. So I don't mind, really. I don't mind being the sort of fall guy and class dunderhead in these Warhammer discussions. But I think it might be better if in future Nicky asked XJ to give his opinion first.
Oh, I'm fully expecting XJ to give a very similar review than to you. So go ahead, XJ. Prove me right.
In fact, you are right. Not so. One, I can sort of understand the philosophy behind it, which is that passage quoted by Robert, which alludes to how well, the way I understand it is the Dark Angels, the Marines, they are all cut from the same cloth. They are all unquestioningly following this particular emperor, and then they are quite disposable. The moment they become it is part of the emperor's plans to throw them away, they will be thrown away, and then they will find themselves in the exact same situation as what's the guy's Latin name? Cephacus. Is that how you say it?
I don't know, man.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah, so exactly the same as the prophet. Let's call him that, because that's who he is in the story. So that part I got, but the action's a little bit too much for me. I think it's I love a well-crafted action sequence as much as the next caveman. However, there's just a little bit too much tearing of guts and punching through of chests and beheading for me. I got like a bit of the same vibe as in Two Kinds of Fools. That said, there's also one other thing actually. I think I might have enjoyed this a lot more if I was 20 years younger. Now it's like, so there's one thing that really struck me going through this short story, and that is how you have a guy with a name come into scene, and within like the next paragraph he's taken out, like just blown off. And I don't know if the character just happened to be a nameless cook, like many of the cultists that just rush at the Space Marines, the Dark Angels, and then they were just taken out just like that. That's one thing, but when a writer takes the trouble to give a name to a character, I feel like more should be done for the character. And if the character just gets taken out like that, rather unceremoniously, it strikes me as a bit, I feel a little bit it feels a little bit like it feels a bit of a shame. And I think if I were 20 years younger, this would bother me less. I think I am less inclined towards gratuitous violence these days, and less I don't know, does that make sense? I've gotten soft in my semi old age, shall we call it that?
I don't know about soft. I mean, the things that the villain in our story does is pretty horrible.
I mean, yeah, well, but you know, it's like so other than the prophet, none of the villains were given a name. You know, but like the Dark Angels that come in, it's like they were given a name and then they were just taken out like that, and that just feels like a bit of a shame to me. Like if a character has a name, I kind of want to get to know the character. Like if if I was much younger, it probably wouldn't bother me as much. But these days, yeah,
Nice. Fair enough.
yeah. That's my take. I think I've gotten a sense enough of the Warhammer universe that if I ignore all the titles that they have, Chaplain was a chaplain. Who cares? Move on. Moving on. Adapters. Who cares? Moving on. If I just ignore all of that, it sort of flows enough to make sense to me. But for this particular story, well, actually, I want to ask Nikki, like, is there any significance to this story within the Warhammer timeline? Because it sounds as if Kaelen is a important figure, and you said it's been republished many times, and it is the first short story in the Black Library archive. So
It's
it
not the first
must
story.
be.
It's the first short story that Graham McNeill published
Oh.
for the Black Library.
Okay.
Not that it's.
I mean, it must have some significance because it's so well received. Is well received enough to be reprinted several times.
So I'll explain. First of all, I'll just read you what Graham McNeill wrote about the story on his website. Actually, so this was the first short story I have published by the Black Library books, and it's a fairly simple story of bloody combat with a chapter that was one of the first armies for Warhammer 40,000 I ever collected, the Dark Angels. I really loved the gothic nature of the Space Marines, especially the Sons of the Lion. That's another name for Dark Angels. This is how you know, by the way, that Warhammer 40k is so confusing, because it's like 50 names for different shit. For the same shit. Looking back at it now, I can see that it's not a particularly complex story. Just loads of people hitting each other with a monstrous end of level bad guy in the shape of the Angel of Blades. A creation I'm still pretty pleased with, even if I do say so myself. I played with the idea that sometimes things weren't always what they seemed, and made me realize that even in a story that primarily revolves around fighting, you still need plenty of dialogue. It's a story I've never gone back to, but you never know. Maybe I could return to Brother Sergeant Kaelen and tell further adventure of his new member of the Deathwing. So that answers two of your questions, I think. No, Keaton was never returned to, and yes, this was the first thing that was published by Graham McNeill. But the reason that it's so popular, and I'm very sure about this, I mean, as sure as I am that the sky is blue. There you go. The reason that this story is so popular is because it encapsulates everything you need to know about Dark Angels, this chapter of Space Marines, and that is, they were one, then something happened in the past, and some people defected from them, became renegades, and the Dark Angels don't tell anybody about this, including their own people, and they hunt them down. That's like the main storyline of the Dark Angels, and it's explained really well in the story. As far as understanding it is concerned, I do wonder, however, Robert, you said you just didn't understand anything. What do you mean? Could you explain to me? What do you mean?
The point you've just
Yeah.
made, the point you just made about the renegades being hunted down on the quiet, as it were. I see that now that you've mentioned it, and I probably did see it some of the time reading the story. But I want to try and get this point across from the perspective of an ordinary reader who's not particularly into Warhammer, is that the action is very, it's like being shouted at so that you can't hear an ordinary conversation, or it's like being in a pub with very loud music, you can't hear what people are saying. This action actually has a deleterious effect for me on the comprehension of the story, whereas if you tone down the action a bit, so I could actually have some mental alpha waves free for interacting with the plot, then yes, I'd probably have got that point quite well. I don't want to go too far in denigrating the action. I think the Blades monster thing was really good, and I think that's really enough mayhem for one story. If it had just been that, but it was just one part of a continuous catalogue of mayhem. So it just went a bit too far. But that's
You
just
have, yeah,
my reaction.
of course, of course. If it had any less action, it wouldn't be doing what it's supposed to do, which is sell models to people about a war game on the tabletop, right? You have to not just think about like what is the story when you're reading it, but you have to think about what is it actually trying to do. It's not just um, there to be entertaining. It's there to represent something, right? And it's representing this world that is made entirely out of combat, right? Like, how do you interact with Warhammer 40,000 when you're playing the game? Combat. There's literally nothing else, right? And all the short, like at least to me, all this the short story does is it allows imagination to wander as to what could be happening in the middle of this combat on this war game table, right? Story wise. So think about it. Let's say you've played Monopoly. I'm sure there's been some times where the cards or the actions that transpired at the table, they sort of created a funny narrative. Like somebody kept going to jail, and you started being like, oh yeah, it's jail Jimmy. He's always going to jail. Like, what do you keep doing? And so it creates some sort of a narrative. That it's fleeting, obviously, in a game like Monopoly, because there's not a lot of things to catch on to. But the more complex a tabletop game is, the more space there is for a narrative to bloom inside the mechanics of the game as to what's like transpiring. And so that's the way I always look at these Warhammer stories. It's like someone had a really good time playing the war game, and they were like, "Man, it almost felt like this was happening. Let me write about it." Right? Like, at least the very early stories of Warhammer, which this is, 2001.
Yeah, because there seems to have been some. We've talked about on these podcasts some Warhammer stories which were much more, much less purely combat and much more ideas related. I can't remember what the names of them are, but
So there was The Last Church, I think that you mean, where
yes,
we
there was
interviewed
that
Graham
one,
McNeill.
case in point, and also there was another one.
First
I
and
think it
only.
was something to do with a plague of some sort.
Plague. Oh, yes, by Dan Abnett.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't remember either.
But anyway, that was very different from this one as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. Well, let me give you my thoughts, gentlemen. I personally also wouldn't say that this is the greatest story ever made, but for a very different reason to Robert and XJ, because as we just saw, it has failed my test. I earlier gave it the praise that it very easily explains the Dark Angels and what they're all about, as to why it was so popular within the Warhammer community. And I still think that, but with a caveat, and that is that you actually care about Warhammer and you cared about the Dark Angels, right? And that you have the necessity and the necessary desire to actually learn it and get into it. Right? So XJ and Robert are both individuals who are, I wouldn't call them regular readers, but they are consumers of fiction, right? Who aren't there specifically to enjoy Warhammer 40,000. And as we just saw from their reaction, although they more or less get what the story is about, right? Like, okay, there's the Dark Angels, they're fighting these guys and blah, blah, blah. It's not really grabbing, right? Like it's not really explaining it well enough where you're like, okay, but I want to know what's happening with the Dark Angels now. Like, did they find all these guys? What's happening there? So the explanation of the main story does not seem to be captivating enough for somebody who is a non Warhammer fan. Let's put it like that. And that disappoints me. Like, that disappoints me, not from the perspective of like, oh, I wrote this and now I'm sad, but it disappoints me from the, like a scientist who worked on something and then somebody else comes in and is like, no, all your tests are wrong, you did this wrong, and you're like, man, I can't argue with that. Oh man, all of my experiments and hypotheses were wrong. All right, I have to start from zero. I am trying to find this one Warhammer short story where if you read it, you could actually be like, oh, you know what? Maybe I do want to learn more about this. Right? We had that kind of stuff with Elric of Melbourne. Right? We read the first story, and it is action, adventure, and all that stuff, and it's a bit cheesy, but it was exciting enough to be like, well, let's read another one. Right? With a lot of these Warhammer ones, it's more of a let's indulge Nikita Zuev. That we're reading another one. The Pestilence one, that's what it was called. Pestilence by Dan Abnett. I think that we were kind of close there, but it still fell.
I mean, I'm gonna be honest here. So one, first of all, the problem with all these franchise stories, and it's not just particular to Warhammer. You can literally pin this criticisms towards all franchise stories. And as they're not really welcoming to newcomers, because it's all very inside knowledge. You have to know what goes on before, and that before you can get into the rest. And it's the same for everything. It's like Forgotten Realms, Dragonlance, all of these franchise stories. They all have this common problem. And I would say like 90% of Warhammer stories that we have read here, like I think the Last Church, I don't know that much about the Pestilence. Like maybe only the Last Church to me stands out in a way that it is removed enough from the franchise that a new reader could step in without any issue. Everything else is like just the jargon alone is enough to put most new readers off. That's it. There's nothing wrong with catering to your already established fan base. That's absolutely true. The only thing the shall we say the owners of the IP should think about is whether they want new influx of new fans, or are they satisfied with what they already have. And if they want to draw in new people, then they have to go through the trouble of writing or establishing something that new readers can get into. That's their problem. That's their challenge.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. But I believe go on, Rupert.
Sorry, I hadn't heard this phrase, franchise stories, and although I may not have enjoyed the individual stories all that much, I find the concept fascinating. The idea of a franchise story universe is fascinating. In a way, genres considered as in more a general aspect, or subgenres, are a kind of unofficial franchise story, aren't they? I mean, it's not organized, but stories like Sword and Planet romances or westerns or whatever, they kind of naturally evolving franchise stories. There's an overlap between the idea of a genre and the idea of a franchise story.
I think franchise. When I say franchise stories, I think I mean something a lot more particular. Like,
yeah, I know.
Marvel is a franchise. Before Iron Man, nobody cared about Marvel movies. Why is that? Because you have a particular named hero that no one else knows anything about. And then they just sort of take a particular story that happens right in the middle of the like the 30-year arc of publication, and then just did a movie out of that, slap, boom, and then that's it. Nobody except a fan would know anything about that character. Nobody would care about that character, you know. So it wasn't until Iron Man, where it's played by a charismatic enough actor, and the story starts early enough for people to get into it. And that's the problem with franchise stories, and that is they usually take a slice in the middle of all of that, and then they just kind of dropped it in and expect people to be able to piece together everything that happened before and then moving forward. It's sub-genres, on the other hand, they are different. You do have an established track of stories that have gone on before, and if you studied them, you can clearly see the evolution. But every story by themselves tend to be standalone, and you can get into right from the start if you are the type that likes sword and sorcery in the first place. So it's like franchise stories are a little bit different. They are very obviously written to cater to people who already invested time and money into that franchise most of the time. Like if a person who had never seen any Marvel movies were to suddenly start with the Avengers, it's kind of different, than like being having started right from Iron Man onwards.
Comic books as a media has been having this franchise story problem for years, because they have this continuity going back to sometimes the 50s, sometimes the 30s, 1930s, 1950s. I mean, and you have somebody who picks up a Batman story, and then some villain shows up and they're like, "You didn't kill me," and then it says below the panel from issue 75,
whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and you're just like, okay. So wait, I need to read that issue before understanding this one. Cool. But for the most part, they have tried to serialize their brand, which kind of actually robbed comic books of what made them so great, which was the fact that the stories were so expanding and things were starting to be more and more connected, and there would be limitless callbacks and so on and so forth. I believe that the real interesting part about any franchise story is whether or not its goal is to simply, just like XJ said, pander to the existing audience, or if it believes itself to be elevated from that status, right? And I think that that depends a lot on what has been commissioned by the people who own the actual franchise, right? Sometimes you have artists and people who go against the grain and they're just like, no, okay, yeah, this is a story about Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles or whatever, but I'm just gonna add stuff in it that I find exciting, and I'm just gonna insert these characters, right? And then suddenly you have a story that's within that franchise, but anyone could read because it's just so exciting and has these interesting elements and so on and so forth, right?
I mean, the important thing for a franchise story to have is for the fans to be able to point to a particular title that says when somebody asks a fan, like, where do I start? And a fan can point to a particular title and say, you can start here. I think that's very important. And that's what's really missing in the Warhammer universe, if I can say that. because I'm actually not a fan. If you ask me, where can I start for Dragonlance, for instance, I will point you straight to the dragons of Winter Night, not
Autumn Twilight.
not Autumn Twilight. And if you ask me about Forgotten Realms, I will point you straight to the Avatar trilogy. That's where it started, you know. Or Elric of Manibone, I would tell you, you know, the story that we covered. That would be the first one to start with, because it gives you a sense of everything that comes after. Like if a fan of the franchise can't point you to one story that tells a newcomer that everything starts here, and then the franchise has a problem.
You can do that with what's it called? With Warhammer, no problem. There's a trilogy of books which everybody should start with, basically, because it tells there isn't too much combat in it. It's not really about combat. It's about the inner workings of the Imperium. It's about an Inquisitor, a person who fights, like the things that are trying to destroy humanity. And he's not an overpowered space marine, right? So he's not like running around battlefields and killing everyone. But at the same time, he's also interesting enough because he's he has this power over other individuals. Even though he's a normal human being, he has political power. So easily. But the format of our show, we usually look at short stories, so that's why I haven't really tried this to get
That's
into
fair
that
enough. Yeah, well, if a franchise has that beginning story, then that solves a lot of problems.
The story is still filled with the specific jargon for Warhammer and all that stuff, and that's just the way it is. It's the same as Star Wars, right? They have all this jargon, like, oh, how many parsecs can you go? It starts in its first movie, right?
That's
but it doesn't distract you because the plot is good
different, though. That's kind of different, though. Parsecs is an actual cosmology term.
Yeah.
The hyper jump and light speed and all that are borrowed from established common law for science fiction, just kind of like elves and gnomes are borrows from like a common pool of fantasy stories. All the very specific Star Wars things like the Force, the Empire, the Jedi, that's all slowly uncovered throughout the course of the first movie. So that's different, I would say. When I say jargon, I mean all the different like dark angels. Like, okay, who the hell are the dark angels? You know, like if you aren't already aware of what the dark angels were, the Unforgiven doesn't actually tell you much. It just kind of gives you like a sliver of a glimmer of what the Dark Angels were about, but it doesn't tell you anything. Like, okay, they have a Primarch. I don't even remember the name of the Primarch.
I don't think it says his name, does it?
Oh, that's even better. I don't even know. It doesn't even say who the Primarch of the of the Dark Angels were. It's like, you know, all this stuff. I
think in 2001 that wasn't established even, his name. I can't remember exactly, but I think in 2001 we still didn't know that it was Lionel Johnson.
Well, I'm pretty sure that the name Lionel Thingamajiggy was in the story.
Was it in it? Okay.
Yeah.
I know that there is like we're writing the lore of this world as we're writing short stories or as we're writing the books. Kind of thing happened in very early Warhammer. So I suspect there's like a bunch of concepts that we were introducing this way. But yeah, Dark Angels have a very interesting history because they didn't start as these knights. And they didn't have this whole like the Unforgiven storyline until the third edition. Before that, they had a completely different history in the first two editions of the game. So, The Unforgiven is one of the first stories which is in the new lore for the Dark Angels. That's very interesting to me.
Well, there we
As
go.
a fan, that's right. Yeah.
But,
and I completely understand. I think you said something very golden there, XJ. If you were 20 years younger, you would enjoy this a lot more. I read, I read the stuff and I got into this stuff when I was like 12, right? So for me, this is bread and butter. Big guts and bigger guns. Let's go, right? That's what entertained me back then, and it still entertains me. And whether that's because my brain has deformed in order to enjoy this kind of stuff, or because of some sense of nostalgia, I couldn't tell you. But I think actually, if all of us were about the same age and we were on the playground, and I told you about this story, it would be a very different conversation than we are currently having. But yeah, I mean, I don't have much else to say about the story. I personally, from a fan perspective, just talking to the audience that watch this because they like Warhammer, I think this is a great story. I definitely think that Graham McNeill should return to this character. Graham, if you're watching, I read specifically on your website that you said the door is not closed. So let's see.
Oh,
you're
calling Graham out.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's what I do. And yeah, for a story that's 19 pages, I think it delivers the action, the dramatism, and the cool ending with our sergeant brother joining the Deathwing, whatever that may be. I mean, I know what it is.
And what is the Deathwing? Yeah,
So
this is
it's
another thing, like I don't know what the Deathwing is.
Yeah, of course. And I don't blame you, right? So, but this is what's interesting. When I used to read this, and I was like, I don't know what the Deathwing is. I want to find out what the Deathwing is. And this spurred me to do more research and to get more involved in Warhammer. So it wasn't like a moment of frustration where it's like, oh, I don't even fucking know what the fucking Deathwing is. What the fuck story? It was like, oh, a secret and mysterious new thing that I can explore. Let me go and try and find any information on Deathwing, So anyway, Deathwing is the first company, so the elite of the elite of the Dark Angels, and they're primarily made out of individuals who are all about hunting the Unforgiven, aka the bad Dark Angels, the Renegades. And they're super cool because they're the only part of the chapter that wears this like beautiful white armor. It looks very cool. There you go. That's all you need to know, really.
Okay. I'm also not too clear about how the Angel of Blades came about, to be quite honest. Like,
I don't think Graham McNeill is either.
Yeah. It's like, okay, so how did this thing come about? I have no clue. What is remarkable to me about this Unforgiven story, though, is that it pretty much has nothing to do with chaos. Right?
I don't know if we read the same story, isn't it?
No,
them fighting chaos the entire time.
They are fighting the heretics, but the heretics themselves.
That's chaos.
Really? They're touched by chaos. That's why they become heretics. They are not heretics because they felt betrayed by the emperor.
Well, it's both, right? So the Angel of Blade creature is clearly a chaotic, malign beast, right? Like.
Well, here's the thing.
But yeah, I'm pretty certain that
because Graham McNeill never really explained how the Angel of Blades came about. So who knows? And the story itself doesn't really make any direct reference to chaos that I can remember. It's not as clear cut as Pestilence, for instance, or
Mm-mm.
The other story about the two kinds of fools, that one was very, very overtly chaos.
No, it was aliens. It was
Aliens?
Tyranids.
Okay. See, I'm starting to get mixed up. Alright. What do I know, man?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I will give you this: the word chaos is never once mentioned in this in
There
the
you
story.
go. There you go. That's what I meant.
But I mean, heretic is basically a synonym. Anyway, yes.
That's
Robert.
very specific to Warhammer fans, though, and that's what I meant. Like, a new reader like me wouldn't know.
Hmm. Yes, Robert, go on.
Two points. Firstly, going back to what XJ said earlier about names, if a name is mentioned just once and then gets abolished in the next paragraph, I understand how that can be a bit frustrating, but sometimes, in an odd way, it kind of works, and I think there must be some way of signaling to the reader that this name is here for the purposes of atmosphere and not because you need to remember it as part of the plot. And I don't know how that signaling system can work. It's part of the mystery of creative writing. I didn't find that particular aspect of the story bothersome. The other point I was going to make, unrelated to that, is that the thing I find most difficult to believe in is that you can write a good story connected with a tabletop game, because it seems to me the requirements of the two activities are so different. I like tabletop games and I like stories, but I don't see how you could really follow a game faithfully and write a story about it. I just don't think it's the same sort of thing. But
It's
just
a spectrum. I mean, you saw it how it's done horribly in the XJ's favorite book, Dragonlance, something Autumn. Obviously, it's not his favorite book. This is a joke. There it's done almost word for word, like, oh, the character said this during the session, so that's what they're doing currently.
Look what
But
a
then,
disaster that was.
yeah, well, but the further the further away you move from directly following and following it more in spirit, I think the more you're getting towards something actually artistic. I mean, I think it would be the same, honestly, because some of the, unless I'm wrong, please correct me if I'm wrong, but some of the Sherlock Holmes stories were written directly with Arthur Conan Doyle, referencing actual cases that were done.
Oh,
Yes.
But in
Except
either case, even if he didn't, let's just imagine he did. If he followed them word for word, like the case file, it would not be as exciting as how he dramatizes it through Sherlock Holmes. If that is the case that he read it, did it that way. But that is my hypothesis.
yeah. Yeah. I guess.
Anyway, all the last thing that I wanted to say about the story is that was a lot of fighting. But couldn't we get just one more fighting scene? I mean, like, come on. It was really missing just one more.
what?
Just to... I'm kidding.
What?
I'm kidding. I'm kidding. That's the reaction I wanted. No, I mean, from my honest perspective, the fight with the Angel of Blades was the coolest part of the story. But also the undertones that I felt as a fan going through it with the Renegades and all that stuff. It was fun. It was enjoyable. 7 out of 10.
All right, well. Robert, would you want to give a score first?
I don't know. I'll give it 5 out of 10
Oh,
because it's a very artificial score, actually. A very artificial score. but it's the best I can come up with. But certainly the style, the quality of the writing would deserve a much higher score, but that's not all that makes up an effective story. So anyway, I think this is where the score business breaks down, because I'm not the right sort of reader for this story. In a way, I don't really think I've got much of a right to give a score, but I have to do it because that's the rules of this podcast. So there we go.
Yes, and
it's pretty
we are going to hold your feet to the fire every episode anyway. So
yeah. In a way, the score is a readership score rather than a score on the story. So I'm awarding myself 5 out of 10 for reading skills.
Very nice.
yeah, I'm giving it a 5 out of 10 too. I have similar views to Robert. The craftsmanship of the writing itself is beyond reproach. But it's not written for me, basically. So I can't really get into it. And personally, this is a personal score. I'm giving it a 5 out of 10. This does not mean that fans of the franchise should not check it out, because obviously it means something very important to all the fans of Warhammer. But it's, like I said, it's not written for me, so like I can't get into it.
There you go.
Yeah.
Well,
All
dear
right.
viewers, thank you very much for watching us. If you enjoyed our podcast tonight, please like, subscribe, share it with all your friends, all your family members. Make sure you paint billboards across your town. Send leaflets out. Pester your government that they would lend funds to this glorious podcast, and so on and so forth.
And put
Thank
up
you very much for watching.
statues.
Yeah, put up
Statues are good.
statues of the. Yeah, statues are good. Statues are good.
Yeah, statues are
I
good.
like it.
All right.
Yeah, there you go.
Take care, all you viewers, and have a nice day.
Until next time. Bye bye.